Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also comment where and what time you're watching from. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. The call came in around midnight, just as I was finishing a report back at the station. A motel on the edge of town, off the A road that sees more traffic from lorries than tourists. Disturbance call, loud banging from one of the rooms. Guests had complained to the manager who couldn't get an answer at the door. They wanted someone to check it out. I drove out, taking the empty road with only my headlights slicing through the dark. The motel looked run down, the sort of place people stay when they've run out of options or are trying to disappear. A faded neon sign buzzed weakly, and the car park was mostly empty, save for a few older cars and one lorry parked near the edge. The manager was standing outside the office when I pulled in, his arms folded, looking more annoyed than worried. He pointed me to room 212, second floor, and handed me a master key. The room was at the far end of the building, isolated, the balcony walkway stretching off into the night. I could hear the faint roar of the motorway in the distance and nothing else. The door was locked, but the blinds on the single window were drawn tight so I couldn't see inside. I knocked, announcing myself. No response. I knocked again, harder this time, and still nothing. Using the key, I opened the door and stepped inside, torch in hand. The air hit me immediately, stale and thick, with an underlying scent of mildew. The room was trashed. The bed had been overturned, the sheets and mattress ripped and hanging off the frame. The small table by the wall was in pieces, the legs broken clean off. The curtains had been torn down, lying in a heap beneath the window. No one was inside. I checked the bathroom, the wardrobe, even crouched to look under the bed frame. Nothing. The room was completely empty. The only thing left untouched was a single suitcase, zipped shut, sitting near the corner by the TV. I walked back to the door and locked it behind me, then went to the manager's office to check the register. The room had been booked under a man named Richard Fellows, an out-of-towner who'd checked in 3 days earlier. The manager said he hadn't seen Fellows since he arrived, but his car was still in the lot. We pulled the security footage next, the grainy black and white feed from the cameras around the motel. The outdoor camera overlooking the staircase showed Fellows arriving 3 nights ago, carrying the suitcase into the room. He unlocked the door, went inside, and didn't come out again. We kept watching. I expected to see him leave at some point, a smoke break, maybe heading out for food, but he didn't, not once. The next day came and went on the footage, cars pulling in and out of the lot, other guests walking to and from their rooms, but room 212 stayed shut. No one entered and no one left. The banging noise reported by the other guests had come from that room, though. That much was clear. The camera on the walkway showed nothing. No one passing by, no one inside. But just after midnight, the door rattled in its frame, hard. It sounded like someone slamming against it from the inside. It happened again and again, enough to shake the blinds, but the door never opened. Then it stopped, and the hallway fell still. I replayed the footage from every angle, looking for any sign of movement or tampering, but the result was the same. Fellows went into the room. He never came out. The car park camera showed his vehicle, a red sedan, parked near the front office. Dust covered the bonnet and windshield, untouched for days. It was still there when I stepped outside to check myself, parked exactly as it had been on the footage. We brought in forensics to sweep the room, looking for any clues, blood, prints, anything that might explain what had happened. The suitcase was opened, its contents neatly folded, shirts, trousers, a toothbrush, nothing unusual. His wallet and ID were there too, untouched, along with an open packet of mints and a half-empty water bottle. The door had been locked from the inside. No other exits existed. The single window was sealed shut, and the bathroom had no vent large enough for anyone to escape through. The blinds on the window were torn, but the glass was unbroken. Fellows' car was eventually towed, and his belongings were sent to his family, who confirmed he had been traveling for work. A missing person report was filed, but no leads ever came of it. I went back to the motel a few times over the following months, hoping for something, a clue, an explanation. But the room stayed empty. The manager eventually sold the place. Last I heard, the new owners renovated it, gutting most of the rooms. But every so often I think about Fellows, that empty room, and the way the door had rattled against its frame, as if something was trying to get out. No one ever checked into 212 again. I've been a police officer for over 15 years, and calls like this one, domestic disturbances, trespassers, frightened residents, aren't uncommon. They're not usually something to lose sleep over, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about that house, about that chair. The call came in late, around 11 p.m., when the streets were quiet and the night stretched on longer than it should. A woman was claiming that a stranger had entered her home. She described him clearly, a frail old man in a hospital gown sitting in her living room, muttering under his breath. She said she didn't know who he was or how he got inside. Her voice on the line had been shaky, enough to make me grab my gear and get there as quickly as I could. The house was a semi-detached on the kind of street that's always silent after dark. Every house looked identical, their curtains drawn tight, no movement to be seen. Her porch light was on, and the door was locked when I arrived, which immediately struck me as strange. If someone had let themselves in, they'd have had to leave it open, wouldn't they? She opened the door, pale as anything, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't say a word, just gestured towards the living room. I stepped inside, scanning the area. The house was modest, neat, and smelled faintly of lavender air freshener. The living room was directly off the hallway. It was a small space with a sofa, a low coffee table, and in the corner, an old recliner. One of those battered, overstuffed ones that looks like it's been sat in for years. The room was empty. I checked everywhere. The kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms, the bathroom. Even the loft hatch, though it didn't seem like anyone could have climbed up there in a hurry. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign of anyone hiding or even having been there. Every window was latched, every door locked. But she was adamant. Her eyes fixed on that recliner like she expected it to move. She wouldn't even step into the room. She just kept pointing at the chair. It was an ugly thing, honestly. The fabric was worn thin in places, especially on the arms, and the stuffing was bulging out of a few seams. It had a faint sag to it, like it remembered the shape of whoever had sat there most often. I leaned down to examine it, even though I didn't know what I was looking for. A smell hit me then, faint but distinct. Not lavender, not anything pleasant, more like old sweat and something sour. Like a window had been left shut for too long in summer heat. She wouldn't come near it. She stayed rooted in the hallway, whispering about what she'd seen, her voice getting tighter the more she spoke. The way she described him, it felt vivid enough to picture: a thin, sunken face, papery skin and sparse white hair. He hadn't looked at her, she said. He'd just been sitting there, mumbling something she couldn't understand. I asked her if she recognized him, and she shook her head violently, almost like the idea repelled her. She wanted him out, wanted the chair out, wanted nothing to do with the space anymore. I didn't have the heart to tell her there was nothing I could do, at least not officially. No crime had been committed, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a stranger. I filed my report and left her with the number for a locksmith. But I couldn't stop thinking about that recliner, the way the air seemed a little heavier in that corner, the faint sourness that didn't belong. Back at the station, I decided to dig into the address, mostly to reassure myself it was just another overactive imagination stirred up by a long night. That's when I found it. The previous homeowner had died in that house, in that very chair. His name was Charles Fenwick, 78 years old. He'd been a cancer patient at the local hospital but had escaped the ward late one night. They found his body 2 days later, slumped in the recliner, still wearing his hospital gown. I didn't tell her. What good would it have done? I made a note in the case file, but that was it. I tried to leave it behind me, but a week later I passed by the house on patrol. Her curtains were wide open and I could see into the living room. The chair was gone, but the corner where it had been looked darker somehow, like the shadows clung to it a little longer than they should. She moved out not long after. The house sat empty for months, but every so often when I drove by, I'd swear I could see a shape by the window, faint and pale, just for a second, before it disappeared into the dark. The call came in just after 2 a.m., cutting through the usual late-night monotony of my shift. Dispatch said someone had reported a baby left on a doorstep in a quiet neighborhood at the edge of town. The street name didn't ring any bells, but it sounded like one of those cul-de-sacs with identical houses and neatly trimmed hedges and too much silence. I was the closest unit, so I responded. Driving out there, the roads were empty except for the occasional street lamp, their glowing small pools of light on the tarmac. The neighborhood itself was one of those new developments, the kind built in the last decade, but designed to look like it had always been there. Identical houses with identical porches, all tucked behind tidy front gardens. Everything was orderly. Still, the address was a corner house, no cars in the drive, no lights in the windows. A porch light was on, though, illuminating a small bundle sitting right in front of the door. I parked out front and got out, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel cutting through the silence. The baby was wrapped tightly in a blanket, crying softly, its tiny hands waved weakly in the air. I crouched down, my torch beams sweeping the area as I did. There was no note, no bag of supplies, nothing to suggest who had left the child here or why. I picked it up, cradling the bundle in one arm while I used the other to key into my radio. The baby couldn't have been more than a day or two old, judging by its size. Its face was red and scrunched, its cries muffled by the blanket. As I stood there, the porch light caught my eye again. There was a security camera mounted just above it, angled down towards the door. Another one was on the garage, aimed at the driveway. I made a mental note to check them once I got the baby somewhere safe. I returned to my patrol car, placing the baby gently on the back seat and called in for assistance. Once the backup unit arrived, I handed the baby off and stayed to investigate. The house was empty, according to dispatch. No one had answered when the caller had knocked to check on the baby. I knocked on a few doors nearby, waking up tired and irritated neighbors, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. Most were startled to hear about the baby, though. It wasn't the kind of place where strange things happened. Back at the station, I pulled the security footage from the house. It was clear, high quality, the kind of system people buy when they want to keep their insurance premiums low. The porch camera showed the door, the mat, and the area around the step. The driveway camera had a good view of the street and front garden. I rewound to just before the call came in, my eyes scanning the screen. The porch was empty, no movement in the garden, no cars passing on the street. Then the footage froze. The screen flickered with static for barely a second, just long enough to make my stomach tighten. When the picture returned, the baby was there. One moment the porch was empty, the next the bundle was sitting on the step exactly as I'd found it. I played it again, slower this time, pausing on the static. There was nothing to see, just white and grey fuzz, no figures, no cars, no shadowy shapes. I checked the driveway camera. It showed the same thing. An empty street, static, then the baby. I went over the footage again and again, scrubbing through every second leading up to the static. There was no one, no movement. The baby had just appeared. Forensics checked the blanket, the porch, everything. They found nothing. No fingerprints, no fibers, no evidence of a vehicle stopping nearby. The baby was healthy, though, if underweight. No sign of who had left it or where it had come from. The footage bothered me for days. I'd never seen anything like it. I sent a copy to our tech team, but they came back with the same answer. No tampering, no glitches, no technical explanation. The static wasn't a fault in the system. The baby was placed into foster care after no one came forward. Weeks passed and the case faded into the background, but every now and then I'd think about that flicker of static, the way the baby had appeared so suddenly, as if it had always been there. A few months later, I heard from one of the techs who'd analyzed the footage. She'd gone back over it, curious, and noticed something. During the brief moment of static just before the baby appeared, there was a single frame barely visible where something seemed to flash across the screen. It wasn't clear enough to make out, just a blur of shape, something that shouldn't have been there. No one could explain it. The case remains unsolved. When you join the force, they never really prepare you for the quiet jobs. Everyone imagines the action, the drama, the running down alleys and flashing lights, but sometimes you're just left alone with a building and your thoughts. That's how I ended up in the morgue that night, sitting behind a small desk with the smell of disinfectant clogging the air. They'd had reports of break-ins, kids mucking about apparently. It wasn't my usual assignment, but someone had to sit there and I was the rookie. The others had all laughed it off, muttering something about earning my stripes. I didn't mind it, not really. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was better than paperwork, or so I thought. The morgue was in the basement of the local hospital, a plain concrete block of a building that didn't look like it belonged in a town as small as ours. It was all sharp corners and fluorescent lights, cold air humming through vents. I'd been given the basic rundown when I arrived. There were 3 floors above and 2 levels of parking below, but my concern was the basement. It wasn't big, just the storage room, an office, and the lab where they did the post-mortems. I had to check the locks every couple of hours and keep an eye on the CCTV monitors in the booth just outside the cold storage. The cameras didn't show much. A corridor here, a door there. Most of the screens were black and white, grainy and flickering every now and then. The place was silent except for the occasional hum from the vending machine in the corner. The first couple of hours passed without much to note. I walked the halls, checked the locks, and drank bad coffee from a paper cup. The cold storage room where the bodies were kept gave me the creeps, but I wasn't about to admit that to myself. It was just a room with drawers. Rows of them, all neatly labelled. It wasn't until after midnight that I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft sound. 3 faint taps, somewhere off to my left. I stopped, holding my breath for a moment, but there was nothing else. The air felt still, like everything was holding back. I figured it was nothing. Maybe the building settling, or one of those noises old places make when they've been empty too long. Still, I found myself checking the locks again, the way you do when you're not entirely convinced, but don't want to look stupid. Everything seemed fine. An hour later, it happened again. 3 knocks, clearer this time, coming from inside the cold storage room. I froze for a second, staring at the door. It was solid metal with a small rectangular window at eye level. I moved closer, peering through, but the room was empty, just rows of drawers and the stainless steel table in the center. I should have ignored it. I told myself it was just my nerves, just the sound of the building. But my hands were already on the handle, turning it. The room hit me with a wave of cold as I stepped inside. The air was dry, sterile, and there was a faint metallic tang that I couldn't quite place. Everything looked normal. The drawers were all shut, the labels in neat rows. I stayed there for a moment, straining to hear anything out of place, but there was only silence. I was halfway to the door when I noticed one of the drawers wasn't completely shut. It was subtle, the tiniest gap, just enough to catch the corner of my eye. My stomach turned as I stared at it, wondering if it had been like that earlier and I just hadn't noticed. I reached out and pulled the drawer open. Inside was a man, middle-aged, bald, with a thin scar running across his chest. His skin was pale and waxy, stretched tightly over his bones. He was wrapped in a white sheet, arms crossed neatly over his chest. But his head wasn't where it should have been. It was tilted towards me, just slightly, like he'd turned it to look. His eyes were closed, his mouth a faint line, but the angle of his head was wrong. I stood there for what felt like forever, my breath caught in my throat. There was no way, no possible way. I backed away, almost tripping over my own feet, and slammed the drawer shut. I left the room quickly, locking the door behind me, and sat back at the booth. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it had always been that way and I just hadn't looked closely enough before. The monitors flickered. I glanced at them, trying to focus on something else, but my eyes kept darting back to the feed showing the cold storage room. It was empty, of course, nothing but rows of drawers and that steel table. I stared at the screen until my shift ended, counting the minutes until the next officer arrived to take over. When I finally left, the air outside felt thick, too quiet. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I didn't even write it in my report. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see his face, the way his head turned, just slightly, like he'd been looking for something or someone. The call came through dispatch just after midnight. A kid, young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, saying he was lost and couldn't find his parents. The operator tried to keep him talking, but the line went dead before she could get more than that. The address was odd, a payphone outside the old Cornerstone diner which had been shut for years. You didn't get many calls from payphones anymore. Most of them had been ripped out or left to rust. This one must have slipped through the cracks. I was on patrol a few miles out when the call came in, so I was dispatched to check it out. As I drove, the streets grew darker, quieter. Street lights were spaced further apart, their light barely cutting through the fog that clung to the ground. By the time I pulled into the diner's car park, the place looked like something from a ghost story. The building was boarded up, paint peeling from the sign, weeds sprouting through cracks in the pavement. The payphone stood next to the diner, its metal casing dulled with age. The handset dangled from the cord, swaying gently. I parked and stepped out, torch in hand. The air felt colder than it had been a moment ago. I approached the phone, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The receiver dangled lifelessly, smudged and worn, no kid in sight. I glanced around, shining my torch over the car park and the trees beyond. Empty. Just the diner and the phone, standing there like relics from a different time. I checked the area, walking the perimeter of the building and peering into the woods behind it. Nothing. No signs of footprints, no discarded items that might belong to a child. The place was utterly deserted. Back at the phone, I grabbed the receiver and held it to my ear. The line was dead, just a faint crackle of static on the other end. I looked around again, my eyes scanning the diner's boarded windows and the overgrown lot. I should have felt relieved, probably just a prank, but something about the situation nagged at me. I called it in, reporting that the area was clear, and asked dispatch to check the number. While I waited, I stayed by the phone staring at it. The cord was frayed near the top and the keypad was scratched and dirty, as if it hadn't been used in years. Dispatch came back a few minutes later. The call had definitely come from this phone, they said, but the number was listed as disconnected. I asked them to run a search for any similar incidents in the area. It took a while, but eventually they found something. There had been a call, nearly identical, made from this same payphone 10 years ago to the day. A boy, same age, same story. A search was conducted back then, but no child was ever found. Another 10 years before that, same thing, and another. Dispatch said they'd dig deeper into old case files, see what else they could find. I stayed by the phone a little longer, shining my torch into the surrounding trees, the edges of the car park, the diner's darkened windows. Nothing moved, nothing answered back. Back at the station, I reviewed the old reports. They all described the same call. A young boy saying he was lost, asking for help, then hanging up abruptly. Each time, officers found the phone off the hook, but no sign of the caller. It was always the same payphone. That was strange enough, but what came next was worse. When forensics checked the receiver for prints, they pulled up several sets. One of them matched a boy named Daniel Hargrove, who'd gone missing 50 years ago in 1975. He'd vanished walking home from school one day and was never found. His case had gone cold decades ago. The match was confirmed twice. There was no mistake. Daniel's prints were on the phone, fresh, like he'd just touched it that night. No one could explain it. The forensics text suggested contamination, but how would prints from a missing boy, prints that were only in the system because they'd been taken from his school records after his disappearance, end up on a disconnected payphone half a century later? I went back to the diner a few nights later. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but the whole thing wouldn't leave my mind. I parked in the same spot and stood in front of the phone, staring at it. The cord dangled just as it had before. The receiver swayed lightly. I didn't touch it this time. I just stood there, listening to the silence around me. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint screech of an animal. I stayed for maybe 20 minutes, then left. The diner burned down a year later. No one could explain how the fire started. There were no electrical lines connected to the building, and the lot had been vacant for years. The payphone was taken out not long after, but every 10 years someone calls. The stretch of motorway was dead quiet. It usually was this time of night, just me, the cruiser, and the occasional car hurtling past, as if the speed limit didn't apply after sundown. I was parked on the shoulder near the junction to the old bypass, keeping an eye on things, when a pair of headlights came blazing down the road. I clocked the car, doing well over the limit, and pulled out to follow. It was a silver sedan, nothing flashy, the kind you see everywhere. I flicked on the lights and it slowed almost immediately, pulling onto the hard shoulder. Textbook stuff. I pulled in behind it and killed the siren, grabbing my torch before stepping out into the cold. The driver got out before I could reach the door, hands raised, his whole body trembling. He wasn't what I expected, middle-aged, well-dressed, and sweating like he'd run a marathon. His face was pale, and his eyes darted to the back of the car, then back to me. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, and his arms shook as if he was struggling to hold them up. It took me a moment to process what he was doing, but then he pointed at the car. His lips moved as if he was saying something, but no sound came out. His finger was aimed at the back seat, and he was shaking his head furiously. I held up a hand to calm him and approached the car, torch beam cutting through the darkness. The back window was fogged up, faint streaks marring the glass. I moved closer, shining the light inside. There was nothing there, just an empty seat, clean and tidy except for a single bottle of water rolling on the floor mat. I circled the car, shining the torch into every corner. I even opened the back door and crouched to get a better look. Nothing. No bags, no coats, no sign of anyone else. The driver stayed a few paces behind me, refusing to get near the car. His eyes kept darting back to the rear seat, his mouth still moving soundlessly. I checked the boot, even though it didn't seem necessary. It was empty too, nothing unusual, just an ordinary car. By now, the man had backed away from the vehicle entirely, moving towards the front of my cruiser. I gestured for him to get back into his car, but he shook his head violently and motioned towards me, clearly asking for something. He was desperate, frantic, and not in any condition to argue. I sighed and opened the passenger door of my cruiser, gesturing for him to get in. He practically collapsed into the seat, curling into himself like he couldn't get small enough. I gave the sedan one last look. It sat there on the shoulder, idling quietly, steam rising from the exhaust. Nothing about it seemed off. Just a car on the side of the road waiting for its driver to return. The man was silent the entire ride back to the station. He sat hunched forward, his head down, his hands clasped so tightly they were white. Every now and then his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, staring at the back seat like he expected something to be there. At the station, I handed him off to someone from the night desk and logged the incident. He didn't seem drunk or high, just terrified out of his mind. They took his statement while I filled out the paperwork. By the time I was done, he was gone. Got someone to pick him up, apparently. Left his car on the side of the motorway. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at that back seat. It stuck with me the whole night. When my shift ended, I went back to the cruiser to check the dashcam footage. I pulled it up on my laptop and watched the recording from the stop. It was all there. The sedan pulling over, me approaching the car, the man getting out, frantic and shaking. I skipped ahead to the part where I checked the back seat, shining my torch into the empty space. That's when I saw it. As I approached the car in the footage, there was a moment, a fraction of a second, where something was in the back seat. The footage was grainy, low resolution, but the shape was unmistakable. A figure sitting perfectly still, dark, with no discernible features. It was there as I reached the window, and then it wasn't. I rewound it, playing it again. Same thing. The figure was there, then gone. The interior of the car was as empty as I remembered when I'd opened the door. I scrubbed through the footage again, my hand tightening on the mouse. I leaned closer to the screen, my face inches away from the monitor. Just before the man stepped out of the car, before he raised his shaking hands, the figure shifted. It turned its head towards the camera, then it vanished. The sedan was towed the next day. I checked the report out of curiosity. There was nothing unusual about it. Registered to the man who'd been driving it. No signs of damage or tampering. Just a perfectly normal car. I never saw the man again. Never found out what had terrified him so much that he refused to get back into his own vehicle. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing at the rearview mirror when I'm driving alone at night, just to be sure. It began with an incident in the middle of nowhere. A man in an unmarked car flagged down a motorist on a back road just outside of town. The driver, a young woman on her way home from the late shift at the petrol station, reported that the man was in uniform and carrying a badge. He didn't issue a citation or even warn her. He simply told her to drive safely and sent her on her way. She thought it was strange, but didn't question it at the time. It was only when she told a colleague about it that she realized something wasn't right. The description of the uniform didn't match ours, and we didn't have anyone out on that road at that time. I didn't think much of it. Probably someone trying to play the hero, I figured, or maybe just a prank. But a week later, we got another report. This time it was a bloke in a van who'd been pulled over near the quarry. Same story, a man in uniform, badge, the works. Again, no ticket. Just a polite warning and a wave goodbye. The chief wasn't happy about it. Impersonating an officer is serious, and word spreads fast in a town like ours. Soon, everyone was on edge. It felt personal, like whoever was doing this was taking a swipe at us. We started patrolling the outlying areas more frequently, hoping to catch the man in the act. For weeks, we got nothing. Then came the breakthrough. A farmer called in saying he'd spotted a car parked just off the old dirt track behind his property. Said it looked like a police vehicle, but it didn't have the usual markings. By the time we got there, the car was gone, but we found tire tracks in the mud. They matched a make and model commonly used for patrol cars back in the early 2000s. That night, we finally caught him. One of our lads was heading back from a routine check when he spotted an unmarked car with its lights flashing, pulling over a hatchback on the bypass. He stopped to assist, but as soon as he got out of his cruiser, the man bolted. It wasn't a chase, though. The unmarked car just pulled away casually as if the driver wasn't in any rush to get away. Our officer followed him, and the man led him straight to a lay-by near the woods. Then he stopped. The man stepped out of the car, his hands raised like he wanted to be arrested. He didn't run, didn't resist. When they brought him in, he looked calm. I was there when they booked him. He had a badge, a real one, worn with age, but unmistakably authentic. His uniform, though dated, was in good condition. The patches and insignia were genuine. It wasn't a costume, it was real gear. I remember standing there as they processed him. Something about his face struck me. I couldn't place it, but there was something familiar about him, not in a way that made sense, not like someone I'd gone to school with or someone I'd passed in the street. It was deeper than that. When we ran his details, everything fell apart. His badge number matched a name in our records, Officer Thomas Grayson. Grayson had been part of this department years ago. His photo was in the file, and it was unmistakably him, but Grayson was dead. He died 20 years ago in a shootout on the east side of town. I wasn't here then, but some of the older officers remembered him. They confirmed it. He'd been given a full honors funeral. His name was etched on the memorial outside the station. We took his fingerprints to be sure. They came back a match. Can't describe the atmosphere in the station after that. Everyone was rattled. Grayson wasn't talking. He sat in the holding cell, calm as anything, not saying a word. It was like he was waiting for something. The chief called in some higher-ups, but no one knew how to handle it. We couldn't exactly put a dead man on trial. They tried to question him, but he just stared past them like he didn't even hear the questions. The car he'd been driving was another mystery. It was an old department vehicle, one that had been decommissioned and auctioned off years ago. The plates matched, and the VIN confirmed it. How he got it, no one knew. Grayson stayed in the cell for 2 days. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, not that we could tell. He just sat there, quiet and still. Then one morning he was gone. The door to the holding cell was locked, but he wasn't inside. The CCTV footage didn't show anything. One moment he was there, and the next the cell was empty. We searched the station and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. His car was gone too. It was like he'd never been there. The official story was that the man was a hoax, someone who resembled Grayson and had somehow forged the credentials, but none of us believed it. A week later, someone left a file on my desk. It was an old case report from 2003, the year Grayson died. It detailed his last call, a domestic disturbance at a house on the east side of town. The report said he never made it back to the station, but what caught my attention was the address. The house had been torn down years ago, but I knew the area well. It was near the bypass, not far from where we'd found him. I pulled up to the edge of the abandoned district just after midnight, the quiet broken only by the idle rumble of the cruiser. This part of the city was long dead. Boarded-up shops, rusted signs, swinging faintly in the breeze, and streets cracked with weeds. No one came here unless they had to. But for the past hour, dispatch had been flooded with reports. Every one of them came from payphones, different ones, scattered throughout the district. Each caller reported the same thing, a man being chased by someone or something they couldn't describe. I stepped out of the car and looked around. My breath misted in the cold air, and the streetlights nearby barely worked, giving the place an uneven glow. A flicker here, darkness there, no people, no movement. Just me, the cruiser, and a feeling that something wasn't right. The last call came from a payphone on the corner, and it didn't take long to find it. The booth was ancient, scratched up and crusted with grime. The receiver hung loosely, swaying slightly. A single coin glinted on the ground beneath it, dull under the streetlight. No one was around. The street was empty in both directions. Then I saw it. A smear of red on the edge of the booth, blood fresh enough to catch my attention. It wasn't much, just a streak, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I radioed it in, keeping my voice calm. Procedure, protocol, all of that. But my eyes kept scanning the street, the buildings, the windows above. Nothing. Just silence and the faint drone of the city somewhere far off. That's when I noticed the trail. A faint line, dark and glistening in places, stretching away from the phone booth and down the pavement. It wasn't a lot of blood, just a few drops here and there, but it was unmistakable. I followed it, staying close to the edge of the pavement, my boots crunching on stray bits of gravel. The trail led me down an alley between two abandoned shops. The smell of damp concrete and rot was strong here, and the light from the street barely reached this far. At the end of the alley, the trail stopped abruptly at a rusted metal grate set into the ground. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, covered in grime, a few weeds poking through the edges, but the blood was there, smeared across the bars. It didn't make sense. If someone had been dragged down here, the grate should have been disturbed. It wasn't. I called for backup. There was no way I was going down there alone. While I waited, I looked around again, keeping my torch moving, illuminating every corner of the alley. The walls were scrawled with faded graffiti, the colours long since leached away. A few discarded bottles and scraps of rubbish littered the ground, but nothing stood out. The air was colder here, pressing against my skin. When the others arrived, we pried open the grate together, the screech of rusted metal cutting through the stillness. Beneath it, a narrow shaft led into darkness. The smell that wafted up was dank and foul, like old water and rot. One by one we climbed down, our torches cutting through the gloom. The underground tunnel was a service corridor, probably for utilities back when this part of the city was alive. The walls were lined with cracked pipes and the floor was wet in places, slick with stagnant water. The trail of blood was faint but visible, leading further in. We followed it, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The deeper we went, the worse the air got. It felt thick and damp, clinging to the back of my throat. The blood trail led us to a junction where the corridor split into 3 paths. The trail ended there, just stopped without explanation. We split up, searching each tunnel thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone, no victim, no attacker, nothing. We combed the area for hours, scouring every inch of the tunnels and the surrounding streets. We even brought in a canine unit, but the dog didn't pick up a scent. Eventually we had to call it. There was nothing more we could do. The calls had stopped and the trail had gone cold. It felt like chasing smoke. Weeks later, I was off duty, walking my dog in a park not far from the district. The park was quiet, the kind of place where you could hear the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. My dog, a big dumb Labrador, stopped suddenly, his nose twitching. He pulled towards a patch of tall grass near the edge of the park, growling low in his throat. I followed, curious but not concerned, and then I saw it, a hand. Severed at the wrist, pale and shriveled, the skin stretched tight over the bones. The fingers were curled, stiff like they'd been frozen in place, and in the palm, gripped between 2 fingers, was a single coin. I pulled my cruiser up to the curb, the blue and red lights flashing against the facades of the quiet houses lining the street. A home invasion in progress call wasn't common for this part of town. The place was ordinary. One of those bland cookie-cutter homes built in the late 90s. The type you drive past without a second glance. But as I stepped out of the car, something about the scene made my skin tighten. The front door was open, just enough to catch my attention. A smudge of dirt, or maybe something darker, on the white frame drew my eyes. On the porch, a potted plant lay shattered, the soil scattered across the concrete like it had been kicked over in a rush. My boots made faint crunching sounds as I stepped through the debris. I keyed the mic on my shoulder and announced my arrival to dispatch, keeping my voice steady. No sirens, no drama, just another call. Inside, the entryway light buzzed faintly, shining a dull glow across the hallway. The floor was scratched, fresh marks in the laminate, scuff marks on the walls like something heavy had been dragged or pushed with force. A faint smell hung in the air, something sharp and metallic. Blood, I thought. I've smelled it before. I moved further inside, my hand resting on the grip of my service weapon. The house felt quiet, not silent, but that kind of quiet where every sound stands out. Each creak of the floorboards under my boots, the faint murmur of the fridge in the kitchen. The living room was a mess, cushions tossed from the sofa, a lamp toppled over, the TV leaning awkwardly on its stand. At the far end of the hallway, I found him. A man tied to a chair with what looked like electrical cord. His chest heaved, his face was red, and his shirt was damp with sweat. He was alive, at least. His eyes darted to me, then to the darkened stairwell behind me. I untied him quickly, keeping my ears sharp for movement in the house. He motioned toward the stairs, his face pale and frantic. The attacker, he was saying without words. Upstairs. I cleared the stairwell cautiously, moving room by room. Each one was the same, messy but empty. The main bedroom had drawers pulled out and clothes scattered across the floor. The bathroom mirror had a faint smudge, like someone had pressed their hand against it, but there was no one hiding behind the shower curtain. The guest room was untouched, and the loft at the end of the hall was just an empty space with a few cardboard boxes piled against the wall. Back downstairs, I did another sweep, checked every corner, every cupboard under the stairs. Nothing. Whoever it was, they were gone. Dispatch confirmed the homeowner's story, though. The intruder had been caught on a neighbor's CCTV leaving the house just before I arrived. I radioed in the all clear, but I stayed for a bit just to be sure. The homeowner was jittery but unharmed, pacing back and forth as I filled out my report. He couldn't stop glancing up at the ceiling, like he expected to hear footsteps above him at any moment. He told me, his voice cracking as he did, that he'd heard someone moving around upstairs even after the intruder had left. I reassured him, told him I'd done a thorough check, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Before I left, he showed me the security footage, grainy, black and white. A single camera overlooking the driveway and front door. The intruder was there, a man in dark clothes, hood pulled low over his face. He left the house at 2:13 a.m., sprinting across the lawn and disappearing out of frame. But at 2:15, just before I arrived, something else caught my eye. In the footage, the front door shifted slightly. Opened, then almost closed, like it had been pulled shut from inside, but no one came out. The timestamp on the video blinked, a silent reminder of how quickly those 2 minutes had passed. It was late when I got back to the station, and the footage stuck with me. I handed it off to the tech team to analyze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something. I went over my own body cam footage from the house. Every corner of that place was burned into my memory, and yet, watching it back, I caught things I hadn't noticed at the time. In the main bedroom, there was a small mark on the floor, a damp spot near the bed frame that hadn't been there during my sweep. In the loft, one of the cardboard boxes looked slightly out of place, like it had been shifted to the side. And in the living room, when I'd passed the window, something faint and blurred appeared in the reflection behind me, just for a moment. When I left the station, it was raining. The streets were quiet. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the screen of my laptop, replaying that footage again and again, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the reflection in the window didn't move like I did. And as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't stayed in that house either.